We sent this one to you, Frank, to kick us off, and it was actually one of our verses of the day earlier on in the week from Psalm 91. And as we were just talking about it, we were like, man, this is a hard one, I think, for some people to understand. And even for myself, when you read it, maybe just at surface level, you read the whole Psalm, you sort of come away a bit like almost confused or at a loss, because it gives you this like weird sense of like invincibility, or that it's basically saying that nothing bad will ever happen to you if you follow God. So I'll just read a little bit of Psalm 91, really well-known psalm right at the start. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Very well-known couple of verses. But then as you go on and you get to like verse 9, this is where it starts to get very like confirming of this, invincibility cloak, it seems. If you say, the Lord is my refuge, and you make the Most High your dwelling, no harm will overtake you. No disaster will come near your tent, for He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. And then in verse 14 and 15, I will rescue those who love me. I will protect those who trust in my name. When they call on me, I will answer. I will be with them in trouble. I will rescue and honor them. And then I think for some people, they then look at their life and then say, well, how do these two things line up? Because I don't feel like that has happened.
Yeah. This is a fascinating psalm. I love this psalm. I pray an old monastic rhythm of the psalms, as we've talked about before, and this psalm features nightly in my prayer. And
the whole thing?
The whole thing.
Oh, well.
And so the whole thing has featured nightly in Christian prayer for a whole bunch of the church, for at least going back to St. Benedict in the 6th century. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And for the Jewish community, it features in a whole bunch of their liturgies as well. And so there's a whole bunch of commentary that exists around this psalm. But you imagine then, for a lot of cultures that have not been as comfortable as ours, where death and pestilence have been ever present and have taken a lot of lives, somehow they've managed to pray this psalm regularly, and I adore it. Now, for those who read through the whole psalm, it's worth listening for some phrases that you might hear appear somewhere else. The words, for He will give His angels orders concerning you, to protect you in all your ways. They'll support you with their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Can you remember where else that appears, those words?
Learn me.
Yeah. Jesus in the wilderness, when He's being tempted by the devil takes Him up and says, jump down off this cliff. You know the angels are going to protect you. And He quotes this psalm. So the devil quotes this psalm as a way to test God. Well, God said this. The Psalms say this. So have a look at your life and try it out and see if that's actually going to work. And I would imagine many of us are coming to that psalm a little bit like that. There's a challenge with this psalm, because this psalm in a health, wealth, and happiness culture doesn't seem to land very well. But in the body of Scripture, you go back a couple of psalms before this one, Psalm 88. And you'll see the psalmist say that everything is terrible. Everything is awful. Yet the psalmist clearly trusts God, because the psalmist is laying it all out before God. And then you get to Jesus in Gethsemane, and Jesus dies on the cross. And then many of His disciples died horrible deaths.
Yeah.
You get to Revelation, and those who are singing before the throne of God are martyrs. So these are people who have died horrible deaths. Yet somehow the church and the Jewish community have managed to hold on to Psalm 91 as this amazing hope. And I think the key to understanding Psalm 91 is in the beginning of it. The one who lives under the protection of the Most High, who dwells in the shadow of the Almighty, I will say concerning the Lord, who is my refuge and my fortress. There's a challenge here for how we approach God and how we're going after God. Are we seeking to dwell in the shadow of the Almighty? I would say that if you're in a place where you're truly trusting in God, not just saying that I follow God and not just trusting in God a little, but truly trusting in God, when you're seeking God every single day, there comes a difference in how you view some of the stuff that comes into your life that our culture would say, no, that's not great, that's awful, suffering. I have a friend who, I won't name any names, but I have a friend who has a bit of a chest infection at the moment. She's been given antibiotics to deal with it. And she's asking the question, should I take these at the moment? Because I don't think I've learned as much from this as I could possibly learn. So rather than going, this is a really bad thing that's happening to me, there's almost this sense where, what's God teaching me in this? So there's this sense where you could say this pestilence has got to her, but it clearly hasn't destroyed her. She's seeing it in a very different way because she's been given a lens that sees it in a very different way. I can go through stories of missionaries who have served in communities where sickness has been present, and they have got that sickness, yet they fully trust in God. But I can guarantee you that they've seen that sickness very differently. It hasn't overcome them, it hasn't destroyed them. And if we view our life in terms of eternity as well, then actually, I know I say this from a place of comfort, but there should be nothing that could overcome us. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't grief and there isn't suffering, but our salvation is eternal. So everything is just a waypoint to that eternity. So there is nothing that can ultimately defeat us or beat us.
There will be, though, those who are listening right now who will be challenged by this verse and then who are also going through their own personal challenges. I think the next part of our chat's going to tackle some of that, isn't it?
Yeah, and I would just say in that instance, if I was sitting down with you, I would approach this very differently from how I'm explaining this passage. So if I was sitting down with you and there was bad stuff going on in your world, we would sit together and we would allow that grief to be what it is. I mean, when Jesus encountered Mary as he came to raise Lazarus from the dead and he knew that he was going to make everything okay, his response to her grief was to weep with her. So it's very easy for people to come along with verses like this and go and encounter your suffering and go, oh, but this, the passage says this, so everything's going to be okay. That's not how we should respond to suffering and grief.
We were talking about Psalm 91 just previously, Frank, and some more little thoughts before we sort of transition into the next thing.
Yeah, just a quick thought on how we read the Psalms. Once upon a time, Paul was my favorite person in the Bible and the teachings of Paul, because that told me like how I'm supposed to think as a Christian. Then I had a crisis of faith in 2012 and the Psalms became central. And I think one of the dangers with the Psalms is we can come to it looking for exactly how we're supposed to think about God and how we're supposed to think about the Christian life. I think it's good to remember that the Psalms are a prayer book. They're a pouring out of the human soul in relation with God. So when you're having a struggle, if you want to turn to the Psalms for prayer, Psalm 91 might not be the first place that you go. Finding some sort of encouragement or an answer to it might not be the best thing. As a chaplain, one of the things that I really support is the idea of sitting with people in their grief. God does that too. God sits with us in our grief. So actually, if you're struggling, something like Psalm 88 might be the place that you turn, where you can relate to someone who's pouring their soul out in the midst of suffering. And then as it moves, there might be other places that you relate to. So just really caution, if you're going to the Psalms looking for prayer, don't necessarily turn to the ones that are the motivational verses if you're having a struggle.
Cool. All right, let's transition to spiritual health.
Yeah, and this rolls off Psalm 91 a little because, of course, Psalm 91, as we mentioned, kicks off with the one who lives under the protection of the Most High, dwells in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say concerning the Lord, who is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. So how do we dwell with God? How do we build that trust in God? I think those are central questions, especially in a time where it can become tempting to see the Christian life as needing to have all your ducks lined up in a row on particular issues. Like, that's the most important thing. How should I be thinking about these things as a Christian? Then how do I defend those things? That's not the purpose of the Christian life. The purpose of the Christian life is union with God. That's ultimately what we're seeking. And that's ultimately what God is gifting to us, is union with himself, being immersed in his spirit and transformed out of that so that we would live out of that. So then the question from our side is, how do we pursue that? How do we dwell in the shadow of the Almighty? How do I cultivate that trust in God? The answers to that are really boring because we've heard them a million times.
No, give us a new one. Give us a secret one that we've missed this whole time.
And this is interesting because our culture wants novel and it wants new. It wants that little secret that nobody else knows to unlock the life that we're all wanting to live our best life now. It's really simple. Simple, but not necessarily the easiest to pursue because of our human nature. But the answers are prayer, fasting, scripture reading, and immersing yourself in the scriptures. Again, not just looking for those little motivational verses. I mean, when I come to Psalm 91, I haven't just got Psalm 91 in my mind. I have Psalm 88. I have all 150 Psalms in my mind. I have the story from Genesis to Revelation because I've spent my life being immersed in scripture. So I know that when I read Psalm 91, for instance, that there's all this other rich stuff there. So immerse yourself in scripture. Church attendance. Since COVID, as a church minister and who knows many church ministers, many of us, our numbers haven't actually dropped significantly, but our Sunday congregations are smaller than they were because attendance has dropped. COVID has broken our habit for many of us around regular church attendance, regularly being immersed in a culture of people who are pursuing that union with God as well. So prayer, fasting, immersion in scripture, and church attendance. I'd say if you give those 4 things a bit of focus in your life, especially if you're feeling like God is distant, I would imagine some things might shift a little.
What sort of percentages do we give to each?
Sounds like, check my diary.
I say that because, you do say that church attendance has gone down, but by default, we're plugging in online a lot more. Is there a difference between online and physical attendance?
Yeah, very much so. I would say, and that's not to say there isn't value online, but there's something about walking regularly with a community of people in physical proximity to yourself, hearing them, truly seeing them, hearing their needs, being able to express your needs and your feelings to them. There's nothing that beats that. We're a highly individualized culture. Christianity is a physical, communal relationship with God and others.
The Zoom thing's interesting, or like people tuning in online, because it is convenient, right?
Yep.
And yeah, there's plenty of instances where you're like, oh, that's great for someone who can't get there for whatever reason, or, but then too, it's turns it into just basically consumption if you're just choosing that over actually going, because there's no cost to you. There's no conversations that you need to have with people that you normally wouldn't interact with. It's just like, nah, sweet. I just get what I want out of it. I take that bit, and then good for me.
Yeah.
And then that's not really what church is sort of meant to be about.
Church is about engaging with other people who are praying, who are fasting, who are immersed in the scriptures as well. This is a journey that we do together with other people. If we're left to our own devices, things can go in very weird directions and can become dangerous, and it can become very easy to lose the enthusiasm for the whole thing as well.
The tough thing with all of those ones is when you really put it down to yourself, is that if you don't make time for any of those things, like you don't really go to church much because whatever reason comes in the way, or, I don't have time to read my Bible, I'm really busy, all that sort of stuff. It really just means it's not a priority for
Excuses,
you, right?
right?
No, but it is true, and it's rough to say that, and I don't mean to say it in a judgmental way to anybody. I'm talking to myself as well. But it's like you always make time for the things that you prioritize. We've all got the same amount of time in any day. So if it's not a priority, it's further down the list. Other things take precedence.
Yeah, and then if people get to the point where, because those things have completely slipped off and they start asking the question, where is God? One of the responses is, I'm sure he's been asking the same about you.
Wow. That's a great way to end in our little chat this
I'm
morning.
challenging, I know, but
That's good. That's actually a really
I know
good
it's
challenge.
true of myself.
Yeah.
A couple of months ago, I was starting to get into that place where I felt like I just wanted more of God, there was a distance there.
Yeah.
And so I could have fallen into the trap of going, well, where are you, God? What are you doing? But I knew the question was actually on me. Where have I been? And so I started to examine my prayer life, my fasting life, my scripture life, my church attendance, because I'm a minister.
You got to be there.
But I started to examine those other things because the question wasn't of God, it was of me.
Nice way to end the show. End your little segment there, Rev.
No, we can end the show. Let's go home.